Bienvenidos a nuestra celebración de EsadeGeo, del Centro de Geopolítica y Economía Global de Esade. Antes de empezar, le quiero dar la palabra a Carlos Losada, quien fuera director general en 2010, cuando se creó el centro, y pudimos traer a Javier Solana a Esade. Sin más, empezamos contigo, Carlos.
En primer lugar, muchísimas gracias por el acto y también por permitirme decir 5 minutitos, palabras sobre el porqué del centro y un poco el porqué de Javier. Sobre el centro es bastante sencillo. En la tradición de Esade, ya en los años 60, una de las cosas que nos sorprendía a los que éramos alumnos en los años 60-70 era encontrarnos a grandes empresarios catalanes junto a miembros clandestinos de comisiones obreras y que allí se negociaba. Y bueno, ¿qué pasa aquí, no? Y era un poco porque había una convicción desde la raíz de decir, esta institución tiene que ser no solo ofrecer muy buena formación, buena investigación, sino también ser un lugar de encuentro, un lugar de debate donde se ofrezcan desde la perspectiva académica pues, soluciones, alternativas a los problemas sociales más acuciantes. Esto tiene que ver mucho con lo que luego se convirtió en un eslogan en Esade, que me encantaría que se recuperara, que era decir, si nosotros estamos aquí para reproducir la cultura empresarial existente, somos irrelevantes, no vale la pena. O sea, una institución como Esade tiene sentido en tanto y cuanto es capaz de retar positivamente, con propuestas, con ideas de mejora, con datos, el debate político y aportar esas posibles líneas de horizontes de solución. Bueno, pues para cumplir este rol, yo cuando era director general, estoy hablando un poco en nombre de todo el equipo directivo de Esade, los que me han precedido y posteriormente han venido detrás mío, oteábamos en decir, bueno, ¿quién podemos ir trayendo? Y de este otear de grandes personas había una que despuntaba muchísimo, que era Javier. Javier era un poco el referente, aquel que despuntaba de manera absolutamente extraordinaria. Y voy a leer algunas de las cosas que en aquel momento nos importaban muchísimo de Javier. Decíamos, tiene un perfil diplomático y multilateralista. En aquel momento nos dejaba bastante impresionados el tema de los Balcanes, nos impresionó mucho tu intervención en los Balcanes, Javier, y también la negociación nuclear de Irán. Luego es una persona con visión estratégica. Cuando todos hablábamos, bueno, pues de la OTAN, de la cobertura de la seguridad por Naciones Unidas, él ya sostenía y decía, tenemos que tener una política de seguridad europea, tenemos que empezar a pensar en lo que puede ser un ejército europeo. Es una persona que no se quedaba en el conflicto cotidiano que te ocupa prácticamente al 100%, sino que siempre pensaba con esta mirada más a largo plazo, una visión más estratégica. Luego una experiencia tremendamente polivalente. Ministro de Cultura, de Educación, de Exteriores, lideró la OTAN, alto representante. Pero sobre todo también para nosotros era un tema muy importante, que era un buen académico. Una carrera frustrada como académico por la política, pero era un extraordinario académico. Un extraordinario físico de estados sólidos, creo que es o algo por el estilo. Y luego también, bueno, muchos otros factores, no me detengo más. Luego hubo cosas que descubrimos una vez estaba ya trabajando aquí con nosotros y cosas que son muchísimo más, por decirlo así, más humanamente más relevantes, ¿no? En primer lugar, una enorme sensibilidad humana. No lo sabréis porque no lo dice normalmente Javier. Él, cuando era jovencito, colaboraba en un barrio muy marginal que se llamaba El Pozo del Tío Raimundo, que había, por cierto, un jesuita que se llamaba el Padre Llanos, una situación límite de pobreza, de penurias, y ahí estaba, de joven. Yo creo que eso indica, no es preocuparme intelectualmente de algo, sino también vivencialmente, vitalmente. Hemos descubierto muchas otras cosas, un optimismo casi antropológico, un optimismo ante situaciones muy complicadas, pues clave en momentos difíciles. Luego, una enorme discreción de problemas externos y problemas internos, una enorme discreción y una sorprendente y admirada lealtad institucional. lealtad a lo que ha sido toda su vida política, lealtad a la institución que ahora le albergaba, entre otras muchas. Y luego un cosmopolitismo, que esto es muy importante porque su mente era propia de ciudadano del mundo. Y eso es muy importante porque las decisiones que tomas las tomas en otra clave, ¿no? Hay algo que no sabe, que se lo he comentado esta mañana, que compartimos, su abuelo y mi abuelo era diplomático y coincidieron en los años 20, poco, pero coincidieron. Pero la poca coincidencia que tuvo con su abuelo, con Salvador de Madariaga, hizo que en la casa de mi abuelo estuviera inundada de libros de Salvador de Madariaga. Esto se lo he comentado hoy, no se lo dije para traerlo en su momento. Y un gusto extraordinario, muy, muy importante, y esto es clave, por la persona. Las personas le interesan. El alumno le interesa al profesor, le interesa muchas veces lo primero cuando lo ves, lo primero que dice, ¿cómo estás? ¿Cómo te encuentras? No, ¿cómo está este tema? ¿No? Cosa que hago yo, ¿cómo está este tema? Muy bien, un último subrayado es la sencillez. Ha tenido, ya sabéis, todos los cargos que ha tenido, pero ha mantenido un trato muy cercano. Podéis hablar con cualquier persona de la institución y siempre ha tenido un trato muy próximo y una vida muy alejada de la ostentación, que es más propio de otros perfiles. Bueno, voy acabando. Javier ha contribuido, como os podéis imaginar, de manera absolutamente decisiva a EsadeGeo. Ha sido el puntal, el centro, ha sido también un lujo también por su agenda, por la gente que nos ha permitido compartir, gente con grandes experiencias vitales y conocimientos extraordinarios de la geopolítica. Y luego también ha hecho un favor a la universidad en global. No es fácil. En aquel momento, al menos hace 17 años ya, que el tema geopolítico estuviera tan vinculado con la realidad empresarial. Y él fue de los primeros que dio este paso de la mano con Ángel, de decir, oye, es impensable que hoy las compañías no piensen, que no tengan una perspectiva geopolítica. Y él lo introdujo con una extraordinaria clarividencia. Bien, pues voy acabando. Además de haber sido faro para realizar ese paso de muchas instituciones que luego han seguido esta iniciativa, pues ha sido también un regalo para la institución toda, no solo para EsadeGeo, sino para toda la institución. Yo, Javier, te quiero dar las gracias personales, de verdad, de todo corazón, por la afinidad en casi todo, por la lealtad institucional. Siempre has intentado contribuir para hacer mejor esta institución, aportar más a esta institución y con ella al mundo universitario, que es lo que realmente a ti te preocupa, cómo podemos hacer avanzar una universidad que requiere esta actualización constante, ¿no? Y ayudarnos en este empeño de decir no solo ser una buena institución académica, sino realmente ser capaces de retar a la cultura dominante e ir más allá. Muchísimas gracias.
We are going to switch to English for our conversation with our guests. It's truly an honor to be able to have a conversation with our two very distinguished guests about topics that have been core to EsadeGeo and the way we've been looking at the world, which essentially is global governance. So how do we order and make sure the world doesn't fall apart? Trade and the global political economy. And for this conversation, we hardly can have better guests than Ms. Rebeca Grynspan and Mr. Martin Wolf. So thank you very, very much for coming over for this event. The structure that we have in mind today is we've asked each guest speaker to talk for about 10 minutes about how they see the world. Quite a broad question, but we've asked them to synthesize 10 minutes. And then we'll engage in questions and answers, first myself, and then we'll open up to the audience. So I'm sure we'll be able to, all of us, enjoy this moment. So first of all, we are going to listen to Mr. Martin Wolf. So probably nobody, Mr. Martin Wolf doesn't require an introduction. We've all been reading him religiously for the past 30, 40 years. And as you know, he's the must go to understand the pulse of the global economy. in particular in these very troubled times. He's also published some very interesting books on different topics as we have seen him progress in his career. The last one being The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. So without further ado, Mr. Wolf, thank you very much. You've got 10 minutes to give us your ideas.
So first of all, it's an immense pleasure to be here, and thank you for letting me speak in English, because I certainly wouldn't have done a very good job in Spanish. The monoglot, well, I'm not monoglot, but Spanish was not a language I've ever acquired. So I've been given the very easy task of explaining everything going on in the world economy in 10 minutes. And so you're going to, since I'm going to cover everything, you're going to have to pay very close attention. So I'm going to start with making certain opening points, which I think are very important. First, what we really do know. There are things we know which tend to be forgotten because they're sort of obvious. The first is demographics. And I always like to start by pointing out that everybody who will be in the labor force 20 years from now is already alive. Now, catastrophes can happen to humanity. I won't go into that, but basically we know who will be around where. And the basic answer here is in almost every country that matters, the population is declining and aging rapidly, and the two crucial exceptions are Africa and South Asia. The second thing we know is technology. And there are two areas which I'm going to come to later, which are fundamentally dynamic and could change very much how the future looks. The third thing we know, which is perhaps the thing that people pay the least attention to, is growth itself. So in the last 75 years have been incomparably the most dynamic period in world history economically. World average GDP per head has risen 5-fold, and there have been only 2 years with negative growth in this entire period. I'm going to leave you to work out which those 2 years were. And the final two things we know is there's a fundamental shift in the location of production, predominantly towards Asia, overwhelmingly towards East Asia, and I'm going to come to the significance of the one part of that soon. And finally, we can be absolutely certain that the world as a whole is going to go on getting warmer. We've already passed 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial limits, and we're going on up. And the really big uncertainties of how politics behaves, whether we manage to avoid or have major wars, financial crises and pandemics, none of which are forecastable events. The second big thing I want to talk about is the short-term future. And the really interesting thing is the world economy has been substantially more resilient, and particularly in face of Trump and other such, and his insane behavior over the last years. And the most important reason for that is there is tremendous underlying dynamism in the world economy. That's why I emphasized the growth point. It normally will grow about 3% now. And my colleague Robert Armstrong, who put forward the TACO principle, Trump always chickens out. Well, that's been basically true. So the April 2nd tariff announcements were vastly worse. His bark was, as it were, far worse than his bite. And actually, the trade structure hasn't been as profoundly changed as possible. And the combination of the underlying dynamism leads people to conclude growth will continue in the world economy at about 3% next year, barring real catastrophe. And for that leads me to my third major point, the really big fragilities in the system. The really big fragilities in the system are fundamental breakdowns in relations between great powers, possibly including war, and two others, financial and fiscal. I don't have time to go in detail into this. but our fiscal room for maneuver in all the major developed countries, with the possible exception of Germany, is vastly less than it was 20 years ago, and the financial system is clearly fragile on multiple dimensions, and I've written about that recently. And then in the remaining, well, whatever it is, 2 or 3 minutes, is it 2 or 3 minutes? I don't know. I want to talk about the long-term future, which I think is much more interesting. And I'm going to divide this into 2 parts: the reasons why growth is likely to slow from the sort of 3% I talked about, and the reasons it might accelerate. And I will emphasize we don't know, I think, which of them will be more important. Of the reason for slowing growth, the most obvious is the demographics I already mentioned. We've aging societies, the labor forces are growing more slowly in most countries than the population. That's really important. We are very reluctant to take in vast numbers of immigrants from the countries with surplus populations. There are mismatches also in skill. So demographics tend to tell one, other things being equal, growth is going to slow, possibly a lot. We can discuss that. The second really big point about slowing growth is fragmentation. And fragmentation has multiple dimensions, but I'll just mention the obvious point. It's where politics hits economics. That we are in an era now of fundamental strategic rivalry, even though the Americans don't seem to be able to work out on the basis of their new national security strategy what that's going to mean. They seem to change their minds every week, whether China is a real competitor or whether they don't really mind if it takes over the rest, the whole of Asia. But it's very clear that's going to be a focal point in future. We are clearly at the unambiguous the end of what was relatively benevolent US hegemony, and I stress relatively, in form of the sort of world order that we operated in. And in addition to that withdrawal, the Chinese are really doubling down on their hyper-mercantilism. It's very clear in the latest figures on trade policy. This threatens, though we haven't seen it yet, radical deglobalization. It's not what we've seen so far. But the crucial point is, if you look at trade data, the world economy is, in terms of ratios of trade to GDP, at peak levels historically, being close to where it was in the early years of this century. And that means it has a long way to fall, by definition. The more open you are, the more it falls. It's much more open now than it was in 1930, for instance, and the deglobalization then was bad enough. So there's a real risk here. And in that context, squeezed between these superpowers, fractious and fragmented internally, Europe has a lot of problems. And now let me, there's 2 other reasons for slowdown. Catch up has been achieved to a significant extent in the East Asians. It means that future growth is slower. And the one really important exception, and the economy I think we should all be looking for to growth in the next 20 years, is India. I think it will be the most important by far. And then finally, on this, what might go really right, there are 2 areas, potentially, they're all ones you know, which could be really important. The first is what AI does. We don't know, but it might turn out to be very productive. Unfortunately, the more productive it is, the more instability it's likely to generate socially and economically. And the other, which I think is being understated, and of course the Americans are trying to fight a war against it, is the energy revolution. The energy revolution is economically significant. If we use the potential that has now been created for cheap solar energy, above all, the combination of solar energy, batteries, and wind power, we could move to really an era, I think, of substantially cheaper energy, particularly important for developing countries. My conclusion, world is on a tightrope. We can really mess it up badly. There are reasons why we're growing slowly, but there are also reasons for optimism. And ultimately, what happens depends ultimately depends, as always, on how intelligent, or as more customary is the case, how stupid we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf. Perfect. That was perfect. So we have plenty of time following later on for Q&A. So then our next speaker is Rebeca Grynspan, who you probably know very well. She spent a long time here in the city. She's currently the Secretary General of the UN, of UNCTAD, which is the UN Trade and Development Agency. She is at the core of the multilateral system right now. She has been the Ibero-American Secretary General and previously the Under Secretary General of the UN, as she was Associate Administrator of UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. Previous to that, she was Vice President of Costa Rica. And perhaps even more exciting is that she has been, she's now, it's official, she's now a candidate to the Secretary General position at the United Nations. So thank you very much, Ms. Grynspan, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Ángel, y gracias por tenerme aquí en Esade, por venir a Madrid, que siempre para mí es una gran alegría ver a tantos amigos aquí en este recinto y amigas muy queridas. Y estar con Martin Wolf. Aquí, Martin, I am not saying anything bad about you in Spanish. Y sobre la cuestión que nos han pedido hablar, y voy a pasar ahora al inglés, sobre la economía global y si se está fragmentando o se está reinventando. Okay, I want to offer two observations. First, on the state of the global economy, what I call an uneasy resilience. And second, some thoughts on Martin's provocation about whether the world is fracturing and what that means for multilateralism. I start with the state of the economy, and I think that my first call is for humility, because this has been a very tough year for trade, but an even tougher year for trade forecasters. Many of us expected sharp contractions following tariffs, and instead we are expecting a 4% growth in trade. It is true, and Martin referred to that, that part of the reason for a better performance in trade is that the worst case scenario did not happen. Yes, in a way, we are not really in an open trade tariff war, because there are negotiations, and the most important negotiation, obviously, is between the US and China, but there were negotiations with Europe and with other important partners. So tariffs are higher, it's a different trade regime, but we are not really yet in an open trade war. But there are other reasons. There are short-term reasons also for the good performance. One of them is the front loading that happened at the beginning of the year because of the expectation of tariffs coming. If you take away the front loading, you will be in a growth rate of 2.5–3% of trade. But that is still very good because it's higher than the global economy. Global economy will probably grow at around 2.6%, and trade will outperform the growth of the global economy. So there are also other reasons for this, and there are structural reasons for the resilience of trade that I will refer to. But there is something else that before going to the structural factors, that I would like to comment, because we are in a low growth path, yes? But the truth is that we are in a much larger economy. So if you make the numbers, in absolute terms, we have added to the world economy since COVID $30 trillion. This is more or less what the economy was, what the size of the economy 20 years ago. So in a way, what I also want to say is that growth is low, but in a much larger base that also gives more resilience to the economy. And this factor many times is forgotten. So let me go to the structural reasons for the good performance of trade. First, services. Services trade grew 9% last year, outpacing for many years already goods. Digital services cross borders that goods cannot do. It's very difficult to tariff an idea and tariff services, and it's much easier to tariff a container. And so services are still growing very fast and without the obstacles that goods are facing. The second, and really what we have been saying is that for countries seeking to diversify their economies, services offers a new pathway, not the low productivity services, but the high productivity services. Second, South-South trade. For the first time in 3 centuries, South-South trade now equals North-North trade. Up 8% this year, South-South. And if you exclude China, because when I say South-South, everybody says it's only China. If you exclude China, South-South trade has grown this year 9%. So higher even than with China. Third, technology. AI-related goods now account for 15% of trade, but it accounts for 40% of trade growth. So clean technologies are booming also. Last year, the world added, and this refers to your point, Martin, too, 585 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity. This is 92% of all new energy installed last year, and it was renewable. And some scholars suggest that this shift from fossil fuels to renewables may prove as significant as the shift from hunting to agriculture. I don't have to enter into it, but it's really huge.
I agree.
So this is a structural revolution for development itself, and it's true that it can really be an important factor for the developing countries and for closing gaps. So these trends have forced the world economy into a kind of dynamic stability. It's a strange moment, but the resilience of the economy and trade, deserves recognition. But resilience is not the same as development. Yes, one allows us to survive disruption, the other allows us to go beyond it. And beneath the resilience, there are fragilities that are important. Martin referred to them, but let me refer to the developing world. Today, 3.4 billion people live in countries that spend more in servicing the debt than on health or education. There were 3.3 billion last year. So the problem is not getting better, it's getting worse. From 3.3 billion to 3.4 billion is 100 million people more living in these conditions without development. So countries are not defaulting on the debt, but they are defaulting on development. And nobody pays attention to this because the markets are not in crisis, but people are. So we have a problem here. Global investment flows are retreating for the second consecutive year. And the least developed countries now face US tariffs averaging 27%. The least developed countries, this is the category of the most vulnerable countries in the world. They are facing now tariffs from the US that are higher than the developed world, than the medium income countries. So they are not only facing higher tariffs, they are facing higher tariffs than any other competitor. And so they are in a very bad moment because, they depend on trade for hard currency. And now that ODA is going down and that foreign direct investment is also falling, the only way they have is trade, and they have been hit precisely unfairly because they don't represent anything in terms of the deficit of the US. They all together, these are 45 countries, yes? 45 countries together represent 1.6% of the deficit of the US. And they are not a threat in terms of security, and they represent nothing in terms of revenue, so there is no reason for doing this. So, in a way, Martin argues in his book, and he does this very compellingly and did today, that we may be heading towards a US-centered system and a China-centered one, with unallied countries caught in between. The evidence is real. We have done this, the first, that trade is more friendshoring today than it was before. And we have the numbers to show that. Trade with friends is rising, and large players increasingly see this as a zero-sum contest, yes. But I think the reality is more layered. We live in a moment where different forces are pulling in different directions, where we are fracturing in some directions, but we are too interdependent in others. Multiple forces coexist, often in contradiction. And these contradictions, it's true, do not resolve themselves automatically. They accumulate, they build tensions, which can indeed lead to fractures. So consider trade rules. The WTO is under strain. Its appellate body paralyzed, its negotiating function stalled, yet regional trade agreements have multiplied sevenfold since 1990. The African Continental Free Trade Area is creating, or could create, the largest free trade zone by number of countries in the world. So today, still 72% of world trade still moves under WTO rules. And that is thanks in large part to these regional or plurilateral agreements. So a kind of regionalism is back, and countries are trying to protect themselves, with these agreements. Or consider finance. There are new development banks that have emerged, the AIIB, the New Development Bank, in Latin America, CAF, expanding its reach. South-South investment flows have quadrupled from under 10% in 1990 to nearly 40% today. And all that points to diversification. Yes, there is, in our view, and in our numbers, we just issued the Trade and Development Report. And what you can see is that production is where multipolarity lies. Yes, the hubs in the developing countries that participate in trade have doubled. So there has been diversification and decentralization of trade and production, including the developing countries. But if we look at finance, the story is completely the opposite. Yes, in finance, the number of economies from the South that participate in finance as hubs are only 4, in fact, 3 countries, 4 economies, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Brazil. That's it. The rest really doesn't participate. And it's very interesting to see that the financial system is more concentrated today in the US dollar than before, not the opposite. The United States accounts for 50% of global equity market capitalization, 40% of the global bond stock. The share in SWIFT transactions in dollars have risen from 39% in 2020 to 50% today. So reserves of the central banks have a lower the share of dollars in the reserves. But in all the rest of the economy and in all the rest of the financial system, the dollar is more is stronger today than before. So let me finalize, not to abuse Martin's watch, to say that we have this world that is more contradictory than going only in one direction. And you have concentration in finance, you have diversification in production and trade. In the military, it's a different story also. In the technology, it's also a different story. So maybe my last point here, and I won't talk about the multilateral system or the UN, but my last point is that there is still a lot that we can do to go in the right direction. It is not certain what will happen. I think that a word that I heard that Ángel using in one of her speeches is there is no inevitability in what will happen. It depends on us. It will depend on the agency. It will depend on the institutions. Because obviously in a world of contradiction, if the institutions are fragile, it will be worse. We won't have the instruments to really navigate better in a world where uncertainty is structural and where contradiction is the way in which things will look in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Grynspan. By the way, the UNCTAD just published last week the World Development and Trade Report, which contains very interesting material related to Ms. Grynspan's talk. So let's move perhaps to the European Union for a minute. Martin, you've written about the two super predatory powers. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more how you see these, the U.S. and China super predatory, and where does that leave the EU?
Well, first of all, I very much enjoyed what Rebecca said, which I think what we said was highly complimentary, and particularly I'm pleased with the emphasis on developing countries, which obviously I couldn't discuss in my 10 minutes. Brutal. We should have had a 4-hour discussion. My view at the moment, I have the great advantage of not being in a responsible position, so I can sort of say what I want. I think where it leaves the EU, in one word, it's lunch. And if they don't realize it's lunch, then they're in trouble. So this is the way I see it very, very simply. The US has decided, at least under the current administration, but actually I think it is broader. So there are many things that are about Mr. Trump and MAGA, many things, horrific things. But this is broader. The US thinks, Trump says this, that it's been ripped off. And when it thinks about who's ripped it off, Europe is pretty well at the top of the list because it was given the hugest and most wonderful free lunch possible. And namely, US provided the security guarantees, the stable world order, markets, and this allowed Europe to achieve enormous prosperity, given where it started in 1945. And I will leave aside the role of the US armies, but that's obvious. And it ran this huge surplus, which Trump and many others regard as predatory ipso facto because it took away US jobs. And of course, there's the free lunch on defense. So they're very hostile now. Then Trump has, in addition, the view, and his supporters very clearly mentioned in the national security strategy, that they think that the EU embodies the woke liberalism that, in their view, is their prime civilizational enemy. So Trump, fortunately, only wants to impose rather high tariffs, not that high, and wants the EU to provide a lot of money. The others want to take the EU's politics completely apart, and you know what that means. So that's the US side. So this is somewhere between rather unpleasant predation you can live with, Trump's transactionalism with the deals he's done, and a desire basically to destroy the existing EU order. As I said in my column on this week, the only ideological enemy in this document is Europe. That's a rather remarkable thing. Now, China has a completely different view, but it is absolutely clear, and my colleague Robin Harding wrote an absolutely wonderful column on this quite recently, which I recommend, that China's view is essentially it should monopolize manufacturing, and that it is big enough, and my God, it is big enough, to produce all the manufactures that anybody in the world wants. And it's pretty obvious, since Europe is the second most important manufacturing region of the world and has lived off manufacturing because it's not a huge resource wealthy region, that means it wants to destroy European industry. And the Europeans have finally begun to realize this. And that's another form of predation. They're going to be quite generous, with the countries once the manufacturing all goes. There is a subtext, by the way, I've talked about this with a lot of Chinese officials. We don't really want to take over all of production. We just want to make sure that the production you do have is run by Chinese companies. That's quite clear, by the way, in the strategy. So the answer, as I said, is they want Europe to be lunch. And that, recognizing that, which is not something that I was so clear about a few years ago, but a couple of years ago, in the case of China, this has become more obvious that this is absolutely unalterable. In the case of the US, I don't know how far it will go, but I think Europe has to assume that it is in a profoundly unfriendly world as far as the two great powers are concerned, and it has to work out sensible and effective ways of defending itself.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Rebecca, over to you. So from where you stand and your view of global governance and the different institutions in Geneva that you mentioned and other ones in New York and so forth, how do you see the multilateral system with this background of geopolitical tensions? And what do you see the Europeans doing, and what should they do?
Well, first of all, let me say that I really believe that multipolarity is a fact, at least in trade and production. What will be a choice if multilateralism will survive? Yes. And if we have multipolarity with multilateralism, I think that there are reasons to be more optimistic, because multilateralism can bring the promise of multipolarity to be more inclusive and to decentralize, part of the production. If we will go for a world with multipolarity without multilateralism, we will go for fragmentation and we will lose much more. And that choice has to be done by the membership of the UN and of the Bretton Woods institutions and of the WTO. How are we going to strengthen multilateralism in a moment that we have to agree that trust in multilateralism is fading, and we have to take it very seriously. So I think that to be a multilateralist today is to be a reformist. We need to reform. We need to think about us. I think that it will be foolish of us to think that we are doing everything right. Yes, that there is nothing that we need to change, nothing that we have to embrace in terms of being more agile, more flexible, and more attuned to the new challenges. So that will be my first reflection. With respect to Europe, Europe has been an essential part of the multilateral system. Yes? And their voice continues to be essential. We have seen some interesting developments in one of the commitments and agreements that have been reached. For example, and this is part of the contradiction that we are living in. Yes, we have a treaties for the deep seas. We agreed on that because the South and Europe team together. We have the Pact of the Future, where Africa played an essential role for the pact to go forward, but Europe accompanied Africa. We agreed on a treaty on pandemics in WHO. So these things have happened because Europe decided that they will play a central role in making the possibilities of that real, and have teamed with the G77 in China. For those that know the UN, you can see, you know that there is a huge gap in the way the G77 in Europe sees things, but they have been able to go together and, put the higher goal, first. And so Europe continues to be very important in that sense. But in terms of trade, China has a surplus in goods, but a deficit in services. And if you look at the 5-year plan that they just, produced, the consumption, the increase in the consumption of the population in China will be especially in services, because at the level of development that they are today is not more food, it is more services, what they will need. And Europe and the US too, because in all the numbers that we have seen from the US, services is not taken into account, yes? Mm-hmm. But in services, for Europe, China can be a very important market. And I don't see why Europe cannot really try to have a more constructive conversation with China, not only about what Europe wants to maintain for the Europe of today, but what is the vision for tomorrow, how you see the structure of consumption changing in the future, in the future years. And I think that China can be a very important market for services and for Europe. And I don't see why, there has to be only rivalry here. Mm-hmm. There can be rivalry, but also understanding in things that can be win-win for both.
Thank you. So, Mr. Wolf, you've recently, you've read the national security strategy of the U.S. And you've written about it. So we're talking about fragmentation. So and you've also talked about a fractured world. But how do you see that with the new prism that we just got from the national security strategy, which casts some doubts on the ambitions of the U.S. to interact with certain parts of the world?
That's a very important question. Just may I add a comment? I agree with absolutely everything Rebecca said. But I think there is, looking at Europe, from Europe out, there's also a question, who are Europe's potential allies in this? And my view is that incomparably the most important potential ally is India, because it's a very big country and it is going to get almost certainly relatively much bigger. If it continues at current growth, and it's still very poor, it will be growing more than twice as fast as the world economy for a very long time. And the Indians are by temperament radically inclined to be non-aligned with superpowers. They've learned not to trust America because they were another big victim of the craziness you mentioned, with the incredible tariffs imposed upon them. And they certainly don't trust China. I won't go into that history. I know India pretty well because I started working on it for the World Bank in the 70s. So I think it's a very important potential ally, and it's going to have weight. And they agree on many things with Europe. And there are also, of course, huge potential trading opportunities with this rapidly growing continent. And I think Europe should think about it. Africa is obviously very, very important. It's our biggest neighbor. And we have to focus on more than just stopping Africans coming here to live here. I mean, we have to get beyond that. So I think that's very important. Now, to get to the US, okay, I find myself in the situation that it is really almost impossible to derive a coherent strategy from the US at the moment. And the national security strategy made my already fairly fundamental sense of frustration about this get worse. So a year ago or so, I would have said the US was trying to fracture the world economy. This is very much the way Biden thought it. And I thought there will be more continuity than there was. And Trump would build on it around friendshoring, building stronger relations with its allies, which in aggregate are economically as big as itself. Actually, in aggregate, it's slightly bigger. If you add Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia, this is bigger than the US. So they have a huge bloc, and quite enough. India was friendly. So that's the way that I thought they would go. So I didn't think they would start off by fighting a war with all their allies. And everything we've seen so far is basically Mr. Trump, at least, regards China. Well, he respects it more. He's given up on the trade war because the Chinese hit back so far hard, though the tariffs are quite high. And it's pretty clear that at an emotional level, he and his MAGA friends so despise and hate their allies more than they hate China. So the fracturing that I thought would happen, and that the book I cited in the column on this by Neil Shearing, my friend of mine in London, that doesn't seem to be what's going to happen. And then there's the only other really powerful force in driving US trade policy, which is basically the force behind the tech strategy, very important for us, is saying, well, we want to stop every and all attempts to regulate us. And the only body that is really trying to regulate the tech sector is Europe. So at the economic level, the strategy seems to me a complete mess, but it's clearly not fracturing on friends versus enemies as we would have understood it. And that's part of why I said we're lunch. We're not. But now, if you look at the security strategy and the wider strategy, are they trying to contain Chinese power across the world, and particularly in the Asian region, by committing themselves strongly to maintaining the status quo, which is very important, not just for Taiwan, but for Japan, Korea, and so forth? Well, they've indicated support for Taiwan, but many of my friends don't believe it's credible. Their ultimately commitment to that region as a dominant superpower counterweight to China seems also non-credible. And my view, and I know the region pretty well, I visited Korea first in the 70s. If you have a non-credible ally who is 10,000 miles away and a very credible superpower next door, what do you choose? It's obvious what you choose. So I think strategically, and then there's this absurd emphasis, both strategically and economically, on South America. It's incoherent, but basically the way I read it is America is set on becoming some sort of a fortress of the Americas. Strategically, this makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever, but that looks as though where they're going. And if so, that leaves the rest of the world relatively disordered. And just to add one point, just read their latest paper on the WTO. They're basically saying we're going to scrap it. They're not saying we're going to replace it with something else. There's nothing coherent there. They're going to scrap it. So I think we have to assume that in some sense, the US has become, on every possible level, the enemy of the order it has tried to create. Will that last? I have no idea.
Thank you. So, Ms. Grynspan, with the sort of a world we've been talking about in this tensions, fragmentations, predators, going back to your candidacy to the UN, which we wish you all the luck.
I will need it.
Yeah.
I'm
how-
not sure I would wish that job on my fiercest enemy. I admire your courage. I really do.
So going to the job, how do you envision operating the UN in this world?
Yeah. First of all, I am a good politician. So
You're not going to answer this question.
So exactly. So before I will launch my vision statement, I won't answer any specifics. But being a good politician and having navigating a lot of contradictions in many of the jobs that I have been, these are very challenging times. But it's the nature of the UN. Yes. The UN is not a club of friends or people or countries that think the same. It's precisely the place where the contraries, the adversaries, the ones that don't see the world in the same way meet. And that's precisely why we have to maintain it.
Absolutely.
Yes. So we will have to learn how to navigate, important contradictions today. But, in 1945, I say, when the UN was created and the Bretton Woods system was created, we were in a worse place. We didn't have growth. We destroyed each other. We didn't have trust. We killed each other. The only thing we had was hope. The conviction that we could have a better world, that there was no reason why to maintain the destruction and the war, but that we could go for peace and development. And, that hope was really the force, the energy that allowed us to build a world that for 80 years have worked in many ways, for the improvement of the life of people.
Yeah.
Because poverty is less today, the expectancy of life is higher than ever in our history. Maternal mortality, infant mortality, things that matter for the lives of people. And obviously, in peace and security, we are in a bad moment today. The disrespect for the international law and humanitarian law is real and is making more fragile the order that we have built. But that's why precisely I want to be the Secretary General of the UN.
Wonderful.
Because I really believe that we can make a difference, and we will have to have allies, and we will have to have good proposals. And the end, probably the most important, is we will have to be at the table. If we are not at the table, so we cannot influence, we will have to take more risk and be better in our proposals and our solutions. So, in short, I agree with Martin in the sense that when you have this, I will call it in a diplomatic way, this policy volatility in the decision making and in the most important, country of the world. Obviously, everybody starts to do, in a way, your backup plan. And then your backup plans become the plan. And that's a problem, because that makes the world much more unstable and make conflicts to be easier to escalate and to get to violence and to get to war. But as we say in our countries, I am sure that all of us think that institutions are important, that to have institutions that work is what makes our life possible. The same is at the global level.
Of course.
And so we will have to fight for it. Can I say something about Europe?
Sure.
You know, I really thought that in trade, Europe wanted to diversify their agreements with the rest of the world. So here comes Mercosur, yes? And it will be really disappointing if now that Mercosur wants the agreement with Europe, that was very difficult to achieve after 20 years of negotiation. If Europe doesn't do it, it will lose the credibility that it can be
Absolutely.
really a trade partner for the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
And I think that there is a juncture, today where if we think that the resilience will come with agreements, if I don't understand, let me put it better. If Europe thinks that it can maintain the life in Europe only trading within Europe, I think that we have a problem. The demographics don't show that possibility. And, at the end, it's about what are the alliances? If Mercosur goes through, all countries in Latin America will have an agreement with Europe, a trade agreement with Europe, with the exception of Bolivia and Venezuela, that are not economies that are integrated in value chains. Yes, but all the rest of Latin America will have a trade agreement with Europe. So we could really integrate the Latin American region through Europe. If we will go for more convergence in technical norms and norms of origin, we could do that. And so Latin America is a region that more or less shares the values with Europe, because here there will be also a discussion in culture, in values, that is important. So I don't understand. And Spain has been very important in this. Spain's voice in Europe has been for the agreement with Mercosur. But let me say to Europe also that the world is watching. Yes, if you will be credible in how to build the new alliances and expand the economy in different ways without depending only on one or two countries, this will be a very bad message.
Ms. Grynspan, thank you very much and good luck in your future steps. And Mr. Wolf, thank you very much for coming over.
So at this point in our event, we'd like to switch from speaking about the world to the center that has endeavored for the past 15 years to analyze the world and to share that analysis with wide audience, as you've just seen. It has been a very exciting 15 years. I've been happy to be a part of it also for the past 14. The world doesn't stop changing, and neither has EsadeGeo. We have tried to be on top of all of the developments, and we've even engaged also in foresight exercises to try to get ahead of those developments. But none of this would have been possible, of course, without our supporters. And so some of them have been with us from the start. Some of them have been with us for certain projects, and many of them are here in the room with us today. So I'd like to mention them briefly. So first, thank you to Fundación La Caixa and Fundación Repsol. Thank you as well to InnoEnergy, to the European Commission and its delegation in Madrid, to the Spanish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, the EU and Cooperation, also to Mondragon Corporation, to FTI Consulting, Naturgy, BBVA, sorry, I say that in Spanish, it goes automatically, Petronor, Amazon, Boston Consulting Group, and many, many more. Without them, this would not have been possible. But of course, none of this work would have been possible either without generous support from the inside. And so first of all, we have to acknowledge Carlos Losada, who planted the seed, but also our former Director Generals Eugenia Vieto and Xavier Mendoza, our current Director General, Daniel Traza, and all of the Esade units we've worked with over the years. And finally, I want to turn to the engine of EsadeGeo, which are, of course, the people who have produced all of what you have seen. With us today are many of our former research assistants and research fellows. I can't mention them all by name, although I would love to, obviously. Our research fellows, as well as former Vice President David Vegara, here in the room as well. Irene Alba, don't know where she is right now, but absolutely a pillar who basically constructed EsadeGeo from the ground up. And of course, our fearless leader, Ángel Saz, over there, who's navigated and taken us through many, many different spheres. So thank you. Thank you to all of these people who have made this possible. And now I would like to, voy a pasar al castellano y voy a dar la palabra a la persona por lo que todo empezó y la persona que es el fundamento y que sigue siendo la inspiración para todo lo que hacemos en EsadeGeo, a Javier Solana.
Muchas gracias. Yo he pasado en Esade 15 años. Solo 14 estuve en el gobierno. Y solo 14 es la suma de mi contribución como secretario general de la OTAN y 10 años en la Unión Europea como alto representante. Por lo tanto, de mi vida, la parte más importante es estar en Esade. Y por tanto a Esade le tengo que decir gracias, me habéis dado una oportunidad y no quiero decir nada más que eso. Gracias y muchas gracias. Y el ejemplo más claro yo creo que ha estado esta mañana. El que hayamos tenido este debate entre Rebeca y Martín, dos amigos, es maravilloso. Y eso no sé cómo se consigue, pero alguna química hay, alguna cosa hay para que este debate hoy se pueda celebrar en EsadeGeo. No creo que en muchos sitios lo puedan hacer. Por lo tanto, gracias a Esade y nada más, no tengo nada más que decir. Yo voy a seguir mientras me sostenga la cabeza y las piernas lo que me va a fallar antes, pero la cabeza. Y gracias a todos, no voy a nombrar a nadie porque estáis todos aquí, a todos los tengo que celebrar. Una palabra sobre Europa. Europa es lo más importante que los ciudadanos de hoy, los que estamos aquí sobre todo, tenemos que estar verdaderamente vigilantes. La Unión Europea tiene que seguir. Y yo creo que algunas de las ideas que se están poniendo sobre la mesa habría que seguirlas impulsando. Yo creo que va a ser necesario en la Unión Europea el tener algunas coaliciones, coalitions of the willings. Hay que poner juntos a los que quieren ir más lejos, a los países que quieren ir más lejos. Así fue el euro se hizo así, y cuando hablamos de la seguridad, que es la segunda parte de lo que define un Estado, la moneda y la seguridad, también debíamos hacer algo parecido. Y lo mismo yo creo que esa idea es la idea que debe ponerse en marcha. Tenemos documentos de sobra. El documento de Mario Draghi, todos lo mencionamos, pero no hay que mencionarlo. No hay mucho más que pensar, si está todo ahí. Lo que hay que hacer es hacer. Y yo esa es la recomendación que os daría hoy. Europa hay que hacerla haciendo, no pensando, sino haciendo. Y nada, muchas gracias y mientras me dure la vida estaré con vosotros.
Thank you, Javier Solana. And at this point, I'd like to invite our Director General, Daniel Traça, to the stage for the closing remarks.
We've talked a lot about very important things today. But let's start from the beginning. We're here to celebrate. We're here to celebrate 15 years, a tremendous achievement. So my first words are for Carlos and all those that followed, for having had the idea, and for having inviting Javier, and to Javier, and of course now Ángel, for actually making this happen. I want you to think about this. So this is a business school, okay? 15 years ago, year 2010, crisis just finishing up. And there was a center in global economy, and everybody's gonna say, by 2010, there were centers in global economy everywhere in the world, every single business school, because that's what business was about. It was about being global. It was about leveraging the global economy. The crisis had just happened, but nobody understood what it actually meant. But then they had geopolitics at that time, and there was a business school talking about geopolitics. Right? The foresight of this is amazing, because companies did not care about geopolitics. Who cares about? You can do business everywhere in the world. You expand. Who cares about politics? Right? And here we are, 15 years later. And for those of you that come from business, if I ask you, what are you concerned about? You're concerned about geopolitics. You're concerned about not the risks that we know, about the risks that we don't know, and about how this whole geopolitical mess is going to create things that are going to happen tomorrow, or a week from now, or a year from now, that you are completely unaware that are coming. And in addition to geopolitics, then you now have to add politics, because politics itself has become completely unpredictable and is creating a tremendous amount of risk for business. So the foresight of Carlos and of Javier, having created this, and understanding that geopolitics actually had to matter for companies, is tremendous. And my first words are to congratulate both of you for having had this foresight. So again, Carlos, all those that followed, and Javier. But unfortunately, this is a nice story, but it's a very sad story. Because the fact is that the reason why all these risks are around is because the system that we held so dearly, so close to our values, is now in tremendous amount of danger. I mean, I think what you know is that all this uncertainty, all these risks are about risks not just for your business, but are risks for our way of life, for the things that we hold very dearly, for the things that we believe are critical for human existence to be successful, right? And this is something that we need to start thinking about, not just how do we manage risk, but how we actually manage our world and how do we try to fix it. I think as a school, as a university, we need to move from just helping you deal with risk to what is our role in addressing the sources of this. I think we just heard, and Martin made it very clear, the kind of things that we as Europeans hold dearly, democracy, human rights, rule of law, peace, fraternity, all these things are now in a tremendous amount of risk. And they are in risk for our future. Now, we are today at a university, at Esade. I think if we at universities don't take very seriously what is going to happen, what solutions there are. Coming back to Carlos said, it's about not just educating, it's about the social debate. If we don't take very seriously our responsibility as universities in thinking about that future, the kind of values that we want, and above all, how do we come up with institutions? And Rebecca mentioned the institutions. How do we come up with the institutions? How do we reform our systems? How do we create leaders that actually have a vision to address these problems? How does our research actually create solutions for the real problems that are creating this? Remember, these challenges don't come out of nowhere. At the core, they come because the kinds of problems that technology, climate, inequality, the kind of problems that have been created for people have made people stop trusting that the system, democracy, works for them. So if we want to fix the problem, we need to find ways that the system, democracy, actually finds solutions to the problems of real people, right? And this means rethinking the system, and that rethinking has to happen in universities. If we don't care about the future, we have young people are our business. Young people are our mission. Knowledge is our business. Knowledge is our mission. If we cannot find a way of addressing this, then we're not living up to our role. So the critical point is the world needs universities to take a new mission. That mission is to bring meaning, hope. That mission is to bring impact to people. That mission is to bring meaningful impact. And so this notion of meaningful impact is a critical one because it is the one that will make universities responsible for our future. It's the same one that generated the creation of EsadeGeo, is the one that we need to live up fully. Right? And so this is interesting for Esade. I've been here for about a year and a half. I knew a lot about it. I'm discovering more and more. I've discovered in its history that the reason why Esade was created is at a time when this country needed meaningful impact, needed to transition from times of darkness, from times of lack of progress, from times of lack of freedom, to times of more freedom, more European values, more economic growth, more openness. This was why this school was born. This is what this school has done over the last 50 years or so. EsadeGeo being an example of that commitment throughout its history to those values, to that progress, to that social transition that we've been spouting. Right? And this commitment to meaningful has to be what we do in the future. And so I think as we are here to celebrate EsadeGeo, what it really matters is not just what we have done for the past 15 years, which has been glorious, thanks to incredible individuals. It's really what we take from this to the future, because if before was interesting, looking ahead, it is critical, and it's something that's going to matter for you, but honestly, first and foremost, for your children. If you want them to live in the kind of world that you had the benefit of living in. So for us at Esade, this is what we are now here for. I mean, I've been here for about a year and a half. This is what our commitment is. We want to take a fundamental role in thinking about how it is that we can start fixing what doesn't seem to be working and make sure we preserve fundamentally this commitment to the same values that have been in our birth, in our history, and will be in our future, and to make sure this happens in the world. Now, there's an interesting element here to take this. I mean, we could say we could do this, and I think there's a lot of initiative we want to do it. It's important that, nowadays, if you look at our programs, it used to be we were about business. They're about business. They're about global governance. Next year, they're going to be about business and artificial intelligence. So we're very much transforming this school into a school that's not just about business, because business, it's a commodity. It's about business and global governance, business and geopolitics, business and technology. This is a transformation we're going through. But there's another dimension of meaningful impact that I think is very important, which is this country and this part of the world. I think there's something, Rebecca mentioned this about Spain, about a lot of the way we've been working. There's something happening in this country. And I'm Portuguese, by the way, so I would refer to the whole peninsula. There's something happening in this part of the world where people are coming. And people are running, some of them from the US, some of them even from the east of Europe. They're coming here because they feel it's safe and they want to be in a nice place to think and to think about what's happening. So I think meaningful impact for Esade is not just what we do as a school, how we extend, it's also how we can leverage what is happening between Barcelona and Madrid to attract here people from all around the world to talk about these issues, just what we've had today, to continue doing and to do it at a larger scale. So I would finalize by telling that what has been the example of the past 15 years with EsadeGeo is something that we want to double down upon. We want to double down upon it because I think Spain has a role to play, Barcelona and Madrid have a role to play, because I think Esade's history make it relevant in this place. And I think above all, because this is not just about Carlos, Eugenia, myself, Javier, Ángel, the community of Esade works here that some of you have met, some of them have met. It's about a much larger community, which is you. So I would finalize with an invitation. I think that the time is here for universities, Esade, to really think hard of what solutions we have to propose. How can we change? I think we can do it from Madrid, from Barcelona to the world. I think it will be interesting to do it as an Esade community. But I think it's going to be much more interesting if each one of you decides that Esade is its home, keeps coming back, keeps challenging us to do new things, keeps venturing out, pushing us to do partnerships with you guys, and feels that this movement of meaningful impact that we can start from here is something that you, even though you're not here every day, want to become part of, want your company to become part of, want the people that want your company to become part of. I think there's a very strong history at Esade, our birth, our connection to the Jesuit movement. All these things create very vast networks, and these vast networks is the way we can start a movement. Listen, there's a crisis. The other guys are organized. Those that believe in the kind of us that we believe are not organized. And I think above all, we have to stay together. We have to come together and start creating very interesting things. So I would finalize with this invitation to Rebecca, to Martin, that has come here today, to all those of you that keep coming back. Think of how it is that I can start something that will grow and resonate and will create meaningful impact and will challenge the kind of scenarios that we've been talking about today. I think it's for us, it's for our kids, it's for the responsibility we have to the world. Thank you very much, guys.